Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for everyone who has joined us already in this video call and this conversation that we're going to have with Jerusalem-born artist Dor Guez and the chief curator of the Bogota Museum of Modern Art, Eugenio Viola. I'm Juanico Moreno. I'm junior curator at the Bogota Museum of Modern Art. And well, for those who know, the conversation will be held in English in order to accommodate and have fluidity and make it more of a conversation rather than just this having the interface of the translator at every step. So I will present the guests for the conversation. Sadly, the other guest that we had booked for today, Lucía Sanromán, the director of the Laboratorio de Arte Alameda in Mexico City, couldn't join us due to personal affairs. However, the conversation will be held between Eugenio and Dor. So Dor is a multidisciplinary artist who works with archive, photography, video essays, and mixed media, and his art explores the relationship between art, narrative, and memory. He was born in Jerusalem from a Christian Palestinian family on his mother's side and a Jewish Tunisian on his father's side. Dor has made several exhibitions and solo exhibitions and in institutions such as the Contemporary Art Institute in London, KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, Maxi Museum in Roma, Metropolitan Museum of Photography in Tokyo. And the exhibition we're hosting right now, Catastrophe, is his first solo show in South America. So welcome, Dor.
Thank you.
And I'm also going to briefly introduce our chief curator, which is Eugenio Viola, art critic, curator, and PhD from the, well, I'm sorry, but the description I have is in English. So I'm doing like live translation. This is why it's a little bit rough. From the University of Salerno. He worked as a general curator in the Donna Regina Museum of Contemporary Art, or Madre Museum in Naples. He was chief curator for the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts in Australia, and he's currently the chief curator of the MAMBO, as well as the curator for the Italian pavilion of this current edition of the Venice Biennial. So welcome, Eugenio.
Thank you, Juanico. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and good evening, according to the different time zones, to everybody. And thank you for joining us for this talk about Catastrophe. As you were saying, Catastrophe is the first South American solo exhibition devoted to the work of Dor, and is an anthological that is collecting and selection of works from the last 20 years of production of Dor Guez, and some of them are directly connected to the topic of our conversation, that is connected to the archives. Dor founded the Christian Palestinian Archive, that is actually a big project in progress. Dor, good evening.
Hi, good evening. Can you see me?
Voila. Yeah, now I can. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for introduction. And I have to start, like they said, that you should never start with an apology, but I'm not sure this is the best hour in the day for everyone, but because of the time difference. But, thank you for joining us.
It's 7 p.m. over there, no?
It's 7, yes, it's 7 p.m. here in Jaffa. Yes.
Yeah, here 11 a.m. in Bogota. So I would like to start our conversation about the archive. You founded the Christian Palestinian Archive some years ago. That is a big project in progress that is also emblematic of your approach with the archive. Here we are seeing some installation views of the exhibition with one of the projects that is directly connected with this archive fever, as Derrida would say, that is connected to the Christian Palestinian archive. And here we are seeing perhaps the most emblematic image of the Christian Palestinian archive. It is Samira, your grandma. I would like to ask you about the genesis of the Christian Palestinian archive and why you are so interested in dealing with archives.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with a bit of a background to explain that the Christian Palestinians, we are a very small minority here in the Middle East. We are a minority within a minority. Among the population of Israel, we are only 1.5% of the entire population. And when I started working on the archive, it wasn't really an archive, it was a collection. Like, I really didn't think about it as an ongoing project that is going to consume so much of my studio time and my energy. But with time, after I started with my own family photos from the first half of the 20th century, other families in my hometown heard about it. It's a small town next to Tel Aviv. And then the city next to it, and then in Ramallah, in Palestine, families heard about it. And I have family in Jordan. It became like this kind of a snowball. And other families started to send images to this collection that with time, because it became such a big project, it became an archive. And if to be honest, I mean, I see it is obviously, it's obviously an archive of, can I share some images? It will be maybe easier to understand, please. Yes? Yeah. So I think like it didn't initially started necessarily as an art project. It was a project of the studio, and it's definitely, yeah, I'll share the screen. I'm trying to talk and share at the same time. Yeah. Can you see the image?
Yes.
Yeah, super. So this is maybe the most known series from the archive relating to my grandmother's side of the family. And as I said, when it started, it was a very naive project in many ways. I didn't understand a lot about the context and the narrative. And I just started to kind of curate different and connect different families. And I think in that aspect, the archive is very unique. But it was like an act of like a third generation to the catastrophe of 1948. It's a meaningful point in time for us. This was the year that Israel was established, but many Palestinians lost their home and went to diaspora. And I think it was an attempt to understand the history of my own family. And sometimes when you try to understand something that is very personal, you learn something that is much more collective and has like, it's like you throw a stone into the lake and kind of make waves. And I really truly think that we can understand history in human terms in a better way if we focus on the personal, if we focus on one story, and not necessarily on the way that we are being like taught about history or read about history, which is usually through conflicts, wars, dates, different agreements. And here it was just a collection of personal stories from personal albums. And maybe this is another thing that really interests me in that project, that it's not based on professional photographers. Like usually if you go to state archives, you have the photographers that were invited by the country, by institutions to photograph. And this became in years, this will become the hardcore, the body of the archive. But if you go to a project that is like this one, that it's based on family albums, so you have professional photographers for commercial uses like weddings, baptize, like different events, and you have also a lot of photographs that came from the family itself. Usually in this period, the dad in the family was the one that holding the camera, so he's usually absent from the photographs. And and the way that it's being curated into an album or composed is every album is very different from the other. And I truly believe that the narrative, that the narratives, I should say, that you can read from this project are very different from, let's say, official history books that they teach in schools here. And I don't know, what did you ask? But I kind of continue. What was the question, Eugenio? Remind me.
The question was about the genesis of the Christian Palestinian archive and why you were interested in. You already answered it. Now it's about the genesis. You know, how many years? I would like to know how many images, and I would like to know this installation view from which spaces.
Oh, this is an installation view from the Kunstwerke. It's a show that was curated by Susanna Pfeffer. It's the first time the archive was shown. This is from the Istanbul Biennial a few years ago. I also brought images from the James Gallery in New York with CUNY. I love to work with university galleries and museums of universities because of the programming, and it's an opportunity to do an open call and so on. So this is from New York. And oh, this is nice because this is the video still from a video that is in the show, Watermelons Under the Bed. Watermelons are originally from South America, but they were imported here and became like a symbol of both the Israeli summer, but also at the same time of the Palestinian community. Especially because, like, if you cut the watermelon, it's the colors of the flag of Palestine. So it became like a very symbolic fruit. But next to them on the right side, these are the boxes. You see the shoe boxes. Yeah. So these are the boxes that the archive started from. Like inside of them, there were a few images. And I remember at the beginning wondering why my grandmother didn't keep them in an album, didn't organize them like many did. And I think only with time I realized that these events that I'm looking at are obviously the personal history of the family, but at the same time were very traumatic. So it wasn't something that they wanted to share in a family album. So the archive kind of, like, you asked about the amount of images. I actually lost count, but it's thousands and thousands of images. And this is an open call I did with the Catan Foundation in London. So I'm taking, like, you can see I'm scanning a lot of images from albums. I'm taking pictures from the wall. I'm writing stories of what people tell me. And this is why it's also an ongoing, it's an endless project of the Palestinian diaspora. And this is an image that is opening our show in Bogota. It's my grandmother's wedding day, my grandparents' wedding day. And this is the way I found the image torn under the bed. And instead of the veil, you can see that the paper is completely torn. And it became kind of like marking her eyes, and it became this very cinematic, almost iconic image for me, and maybe the most well-known from the archive as a project. And I thought it's very poetic because it tells the story. This was the first Palestinian wedding after the 1948 war, so they call the photographer. So it's a very personal moment, but also a moment that you can read in a larger context because it shows that life did continue afterwards, and it became like this very historical, important moment. And I think the work tries to tell the story of obviously the image itself, but also what happened to the photograph as an object. It wasn't kept in an album, it was torn, and this is relating to the trauma of 48. This is my grandfather that you saw with the watermelons under the bed. This is him much younger. I think it's a wonderful image that really tells a lot about the region, the Middle East at the time, because there is like a junction of so many different influences and cultures here. My grandfather was not a cowboy, of course, but Western started in America in the 40s and really influenced the entire world. So he went into the studio of a Jewish photographer in Jaffa. He asked to be dressed like a cowboy. You can see, like, this is a plastic, like, gun, and the shoes, he was an engineer. The shoes are not of a cowboy. The shoes are of an engineer, someone that goes to the office. And he's sitting on this paper cut, like, horse, and the background, the majority of the backgrounds were painted back then in Germany and Austria, so it was imported from Europe, and it's a representation of landscape that is not local, it's a European landscape. So you have this Palestinian man being photographed by a Jewish photographer, dressed as an American with a German background, like European background. So this is the kind of, you can't invent it. This is the kind of a junction that history can provide. And you can understand that culture and identity is something that is always in a kind of negotiation.
Yeah.
I can go on and on, so I'm just stopping myself. I'll pick maybe one more image from the archive. This is a group photo of the engineer department during British Palestine, during British Mandate, of the engineers of Tel Aviv and Jaffa. Tel Aviv was the first Hebrew city, and Jaffa is obviously an ancient city, and the majority of the population there were Palestinians. And you can see that they're all sitting together. Here, the background is the landscape of this region. And I think it's interesting to look at this image because sometimes when you look into archives, like Zionist archives, for example, I wrote my PhD on Zionist archives. And, or if you look at the new archives that are being collected and built in the region and in Palestine, there is always a kind of an agenda that stands behind them that is nationalistic in many ways. But in this image, you can see that the reality was that people did sit and work together. There is no colonial gaze here. They're all like sitting together the same. There is no hierarchy. You don't see the Palestinian, like you see it many times in Zionist archive. You don't see him as a worker from the back in a very colonial kind of typical way of photographing. They're all kind of like sitting in front of the cameraman. Yes, next question, Eugenio.
No, what about the next image that you quickly showed?
The next image is connected actually to our show. This is, you mentioned the Christian Palestinian Archive, but this was just the starting point of my interest in archives. I worked with many different archives in Armenia, in Turkey, in Palestine. And this is the archive of the American colony. It was a group of Americans that came to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, in the 19th century to build this kind of like utopic society. You can see this is a photograph taken in Jerusalem, in a historical site. And you can see by the way that they're dressed that they are not local. Like they have like this kind of suits and dresses. And this is a group photograph of them. And what's interesting about them is that they opened maybe the most extended and important photography department of the region, the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, photographing Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, the entire region. And I was invited a few years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, to work with this archive. And this connected to our show. The first object that really caught my eye was this album titled Jerusalem, that made out of olive tree. And when I opened the album, I saw this beautiful pressed flowers that the American colony created. And it was very interesting to see that in a period of over 100 years, the sheet, the paper that was on top of it, the silk paper that's supposed to kind of suffocate all the humidity, created a kind of a footprint of the plants, of these arrangements. And I'm very interested in traces, traces of violence, but also traces of plants, of the landscape. And what I did, here, these are a few images of these papers. I photographed on a light box the plants themselves, and then I photographed separately the yellow pigment, like this kind of a footprint that was left. And if you look at the footprint here, you can identify the colors in the result. Because what I did, I recomposed the album. I took all the colors out, created a digital photogram, and insert all the yellow pigment. And they became this, we have in the show 2 or 3 of them, became this beautiful like bouquet of flowers that are natural, but at the same time, they're not represented. They're not represented. They don't really represent nature, if it makes any sense, because it's very much composed and arranged. It was made for colonial eye. It's nature that is being composed into this European bouquets, and they have these titles underneath of different locations in the Holy Land, like Nazareth, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and so on. This is a close-up, so you can see that the way it was photographed, because of the light box, it's kind of an X-ray into the material. So you can really see the veins of the flowers and the material itself. And even though it's positive, because the pigment was yellow, I looked at it, and it's like an A4, the size, and I looked at it as negatives, and I enlarged it. I reverted, and I made, this is a big part of the show. Oh, this is how it looks printed.
Mm-hmm.
And I made these large-scale prints. The title of the show is Lilies of the Field, which is also kind of a colonial title to I forgot how to say this name of the flower in English, but the flower has like a native name, and they changed it all to like kind of Christian names or something that will appeal to the English speakers or Italian, Spanish, and so on from Europe. And I enlarged it, and there are massive prints, 175 centimeters of different locations throughout the Holy Land. And if you notice, I didn't say Palestine, I didn't say the land of Israel, I didn't relate to it, or the Promised Land. I called it Holy Land because it's like, this is how they looked at it, the American colony people. In a way, it was like a kind of almost an idea of a place, a mythical place, than an actual physical location. So this is how it looks when it's framed. This is from a different show, but we also have them at MAMBO, which I can actually look for it. Here, I'm stopping. I will look for the images of MAMBO while you are asking your next question.
Yeah.
You spoke about the technique, how you created this kind of phantasmatic, I would say, series that is dealing with flowers. All the other images that are coming from the Christian Palestinian archive, they are scanograms, for example. Would you like to tell us a bit more about this technique?
Yes, you are right. It's two different techniques. I'm going to share screen, just a second, with the image from the show. Can you see now? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is from our show. So you were right. These are photographs. As I said, it was the archival objects were photographed on a light box, kind to connect photography to its origin, that is both aesthetic and scientific at the same time, because photography was invented as a patent. I'm always like kind of like looking at the history to understand something about the present. Maybe I should have said it earlier, that I think like I'm so fascinated. I think humans are so fascinated with history and archives because they want to understand themselves. They want to understand the present. Yeah. But yes, going back to your question about scanograms, scanography is kind of a technique that I'm using in the studio. That I'm taking different scanners, and using them as cameras in order to kind of transfer a three-dimensional experience of the object. So I'm using like 3 different scanners because each one of them have different quality. And then sometimes it's like dozens of little scans of an object that became like the actual print. And in the case of my grandmother with the wedding photographs, for example, that you saw the image was torn, the reason that I use the scanners is really to give you like a kind of a 3-dimensional experience. And I think that when you see the image, you really feel like there is different layers. And again, it's going back to the gaze on what happened to the photograph as an object, not something that we restore, but something that we look like what time left on the image. And it's kind of like, this is a kind of like a journey of photo albums and photography in general. At the end, they disappear. Photos will fade, albums will get lost or burn or replace. And I think the Christian Palestinian Archive, one of the main goals of it is to create like a digital kind of version of the actual condition, like the actual one point in time of how this object looks like. And then the majority of them are being returned to the owners after the scan. Was it clear? I was trying to. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. It was extremely super clear. I was considering looking at your work as a whole also, your approach to the photography as a medium is very pictorial. I was going back to the first exhibition that I have seen in Petach Tikva. Hopefully I pronunciated properly.
Yes, you did.
Back in 2010, for example, where I saw the first time your work and also the photos of Lid. Actually, it is a city that is coming. It is from your mom's side of the family is coming from there. Also, 40 Days is depicting another part of Lid. Basically, would like to tell us something about 40 Days, because it's also connected to this archival impulse.
Something about 40 Days. Oh, you mean the series that we have? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so let me open. It's good that I have all the images of the show in case someone in the audience didn't see the show. I think it would be nice if I open it. So yes, 40 Days is a project that I started in 2010. And it's kind of like had different lives. I'm looking for images from the show of it. Maybe you have to share because I don't see any. Nico, do you have something?
Yes.
40 Days was the kind of like what we had in the loop in the video right before. I don't know, maybe we can put it back.
But wait, I will open a presentation of it because I think it's important to actually see the images. But 40 Days is the time that Christians believe, like Orthodox Christians or Eastern Christians, that it takes from the soul to leave the body and go to, let's hope, heaven, to the next word. And the video was made, the video and the photographs, it's like a photo installation, were made to around the death of my grandfather and the destruction of the cemetery. Here, I found it. Let's start. Ah, you're showing it. Great. I'm going to take over for Nico to share screen.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, you can see the image. So when my grandfather was alive, like every few years, the cemetery, our cemetery in Lod, or Lida, or Lid, is being destroyed as a hate crime by different extreme groups. And we went to take photographs, not as an artistic project. We went to take photographs for the police as evidence of what happened to the stones, how the cemetery was vandalized. And after like few days, the police told us that they didn't solve the crime. They don't know what to do with what became evidence, the photograph that we took. And they asked us if we want to take the police evidence back to us, like the prints themselves. And we did. And then a few years later, I was sitting with my grandmother in the living room, and there's the camera between us, like the video camera. And she got used to it because I'm filming all the time. And I asked her, what happened to the photograph that we got back from the police? And she said she kept them in the kitchen drawer. So it's on video, I'm going to the kitchen drawer, I'm taking the photographs. And because she kept them in the kitchen, when I opened them, they kind of got glued to one another. And then we kind of separating each image from one another. And what happened, and you can see it in this hunting image, is that you have like, they got torn and the emulsion of the photograph was kind of like, because of the moist, was kind of destroyed. So again, you have like evidence of ruins that became like a topic. And when you look at the series, it's like a distraction of the photograph as an object that is framing the destruction of the cemetery itself. And it's very disturbing. This marble was ruined, was broken to so many small pieces that today we don't even remember who was buried there. So we replace it with a blank marble. And this is the cemetery of my great-grandmother that was destroyed. And here you can see the paper, you can see the marble, and you can see the bones with the suit, and that's the father of my grandfather. So it was very, it's like looking from up down. It's like a kind of the sarcophage. So it's really, it was like heartbreaking for us to take these images. And you can see the shadow here of my grandfather standing up on top of the grave. And we are taking photographs for the police. And the way that they're printed in the show, the scale is so massive, so it's almost one-to-one, almost like walking in the cemetery. And the scale of each grave of the stone itself is very similar to reality. So you have like a kind of a physical connection to the image, and at the same time, the destruction becomes like almost like painting on top of it. The different layers. Like here, this, if you go closer, it's like, how do you call it, a fingerprint that becomes like the kind of like a print of, like a massive print in the exhibition. Yeah, and you can see them here in a different show. Like this is the scale.
Yeah, it's 101 basically.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, I mean, from like this very rich introduction and kind of like description of your work, both at MAMBO and in general that you're doing with Archive, I mean, we see, or at least I can summarize it as Archive being, first of all, like not something that is neutral. Archive is never neutral. Like Archive always has a sight, a gaze, an intention most of the times, not only the intention of the photographer, but also the intention of the institution or person or group of people that actually gathers this series of images and turn it into something accessible and something that tells a story, right? So the telling of the story is always something that mediates whatever endeavor goes behind any series of images, whether it be archival or whether it be artistic as well. And in that sense, I would like to perhaps connect with a question to Eugenio before we perhaps before opening it up after for the guests. And it would be Eugenio. I mean, of course, you have a long career as a curator and working in several continents, probably all 5 continents. And of course, you have had worked with a lot of artists who also make use of the archive, reference the archive. However, you may even say that each artist treat the archive in a different way, almost each of them treating them in their own special way. So how would you connect Dor's work with perhaps other artists you have worked in the past, or with these several approaches that you've had also as a curator to this understanding that Dor has of the archive?
Yeah, as you said, I dealt with a lot of artists that they usually work with the archive. What I see in common basically is what I like to call quoting Giorgio Agamben, the Italian photographer, the Italian philosopher, you know, the archaeological approach to the present is, you know, is quoting the past in order to question and dialogue with the present. I think that this is the main preoccupation of the artists basically are dealing with the archive. Even, for example, you know, there is Oquiembens or this big exhibition titled Archive Fever, quoting the Derrida, and he divided several different kind of approach to the archive. For example, there are also a lot of artists from the Middle East that they usually use, that they share with Dor this aesthetic strategy, basically working with the archive. One of my projects in Australia was of a Lebanese artist that is part of the Lebanese diaspora, that he moved to Australia in the end of the 70s, for example. It is a kind of approach to the archive. It is in a way similar how the way that Dors is dealing with the archive. In this picture, we see also finally the title piece of the exhibition. It is Catastrophe. It was mentioned by Dor in the beginning, actually. Would you like to speak a bit about this series? It was presented for the first time here at MAMBO.
Wait, I'm on mute.
Okay.
Sure. Yes. Because it's really not stage our conversation. I'm like during I'm trying to find the images to share. Here, I found it. View. I'm going to share. But maybe just to say something about what to relate to Juanico's question as well, if I can.
Of course.
I think I think photography is always a manipulation. Like there is, like Susan Sontag said, there is truth in it, but it's always manipulated. And in that sense, it's we can elaborate this conversation and not think only as photograph as something that is a manipulation because of crop, because of perspective, because of empowering a specific moment, and so on and so on. But when you go to archive, it becomes even more complicated or complex because it's not the single image, it's like the relationship and the context of a group of images that you see together. And then, you know, we can look at it from a very like critical perspective and saying this historian will tell this story and this historian will tell that story, but this historian has this agenda and the other one has a different agenda. But in a way, it's also like a family. Like you all experience like an event, and everybody comes out with a different story. So always when I'm being asked, like, do you think you tell the story of like a community, of something that is larger than you? I almost want to say no. I'm telling the story from my perspective. I'm telling a story from a very specific point of view, and I think you can learn about it from you can learn from it about others. But this is not my intention. I'm not a politician. I'm not trying to even assume that I can speak in the voice of others. So it's always a kind of like fiction and truth, or maybe fiction is not the right word. It's always kind of interpretation and truth. What is the truth? Catastrophe, the title of our exhibition, is named after the last series I did, photographing in a forest very close to my hometown. And catastrophe in Arabic, we said Nakba, it's the title of, it's how we relate Palestinians to 48. It was a specific event in time, a diaspora of almost 1 million Palestinians. And in this series, what I did, I went to one of the Palestinian villages that is very close to Lod. And I'm photographing the remains, the ruins of it. Usually the roof was bombed, so people cannot go back to their houses. And then later on, different organizations like the Jewish National Fund planted trees on top of it. And it created this very unusual forests all across the country that you go and you basically go through the forest and there are ruins of Palestinian villages under the pine. And the reason that they chose the pines is that they kind of spread very quickly. They don't need a lot of care. They have a European look. And we have to remember that the majority of the Jewish population, institutional Jewish population, was European. So they kind of copied the landscape of Europe. But also at the same time, they kind of like reshaped the entire understanding of what the landscape is. So now, 70 years later, or even more, when you go to this forest, like among the first forests that were planted, because this is not an indigenous tree, the land is not like thick enough to hold them anymore, and they kind of fall. So if you look at these images, they like images of the ruins of the villages. This is like a floor that is torn that looks like rocks, but it's also like these bodies of trees that are just falling on top of it. So it's also an ecological kind of disaster. And this image you can see in the back, you can see the pines. They have this like orange color. You see like Palestinian terraces, like these stones here on the right. These are massive prints. I hope you can learn something from the screen. And you can see another plant that was imported from South America, and that's a cactus fruit that Palestinians used as fences. So you go into this very weird ecological system of plants that are not supposed to be there and kind of inhabit acres on acres of this country. And it will, at the end, it will end because it won't last because they're not native plants. So this is how we title the exhibition. And again, I think the personal is very important because I was relating in the exhibition to the private catastrophe, and I'm photographing in the private, in the closest landscape that I know and grew up with. So you walk through this forest. A forest is beautiful, yes, it's magical, but at the same time you see that these floors that look very naive, or these ruins are here. Zooming in, these are ruins of houses. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for showing the kind of like the title piece. I don't know if we perhaps should have started by this, but good thing you brought it up. I also wanted to sort of like interrupt a little bit the conversation in order to tell all of the participants that they can write their questions over in the chat. And instead of like, I don't know if people is perhaps too shy to say them out loud, perhaps we can just go through them over the chat and then have, yeah, kind of like open questions from there. In the meantime, I would go back to perhaps Eugenio and then ask him what is his perspective on this issue, this topic that was brought up by Dor. This issue, well, not issue, but this aspect of photography, of fiction, or as he said, of interpretation, right? Rather than perhaps fiction. Or, I mean, there's some other critics that have talked about photographic image as well as kind of like a dream or a feverish dream, perhaps. So how do you see and how do you relate to photographic image from your practice as a curator?
You mean connected to the archive?
I mean, kind of like the quality or this quality of the image to basically be taking most of the time as face value, you know, and to be taking as truth, but always, you know, having this issue of the interpretation of the photographer, the interpretation of the person who actually looks at the image, and how much of the photographic image is fiction versus how much of it is truth.
As Dor was saying before, photography is always a kind of interpretation. So it's a kind also of context, basically connected to the interpretation itself.
Was it a question to me? Sorry. I think it would be very wrong to think about the way that we look at archives or the way that we try to contextualize it as something that is nostalgic. I think that it's a mirror, it's an enlargement of ourselves in a way. And it's a mirror to what we think we understand, because the interpretation, again, it's something that we always bring from the contemporary. The way that I look at these images is very different from the way that my dad will look at them, the way from my grandfather will look at them. So it's always like there is a different story that comes out of it. And it is an enlargement of ourselves, and not necessarily like, oh, let's go to a nostalgic, like kind of like road into the past. So I hope I elaborated it. Someone is asking a question. Would you like to comment on that? The right to the personal and collective? No.
No, wait. Can you like read it aloud?
It's everyone can see it. It is asking.
Some people are listening to this over the phone, so maybe they're not checking the screen.
She's asking Eugenio, not me. Would you like to comment?
No, she's asking to you.
You don't know.
It says hi, Dor.
You're both in trouble now.
Yeah.
You're assuming what I'm asking. Done. I'm joking. I'm joking.
But wait, for those who can't see it, I haven't seen Documenta, so I won't comment. But would you like to comment on the events at Documenta as they relate to the personal and collective experience? So honestly, I feel like it's wrong for me to comment on an exhibition I didn't see. But Eugenio, have you seen the Documenta? No.
Unfortunately, no.
Not yet.
I don't think that I will see it. No.
Maybe I can just clarify the question. It's just about the conflict as it relates to a personal and collective experience. And Dor, you spoke very beautifully about how your work claims to, or not claims, but you aim to speak about your personal experience. And if someone can learn about a bigger experience, that's great. But you don't, speak for other people. So I was just wondering if that was something that resonated when you read, at least about the conflict, or if it's not interesting, we can skip the question.
The question is interesting, Olit, but I'm not going to give you a different answer because I really think it's unfair. I haven't seen the pieces and I don't know the artists that are presenting there. So to give you an answer like relating to something I didn't experience, I think it's irresponsible. But maybe Eugenio, do you want to say something about it?
No, it's the same. I didn't see the exhibition. I don't know the artist. So all the information that I have, basically, I acquired from the media. So that's
a good point, because we acquired information, like everything we know by already interpretation of someone else.
Yeah,
So maybe here we can connect to what I said before, like in order to respond to something and to have a kind of reaction, either it's verbal or visual, I believe that one should actually like experience it itself.
yeah.
That's a good point. And maybe the whole thing is in the media, or mostly in the media, as far as the conflict goes.
It is.
But
It is. I agree. I will say that, Orit, that I think we live in time that, in many times, a discussion or people like has like very strong opinions that they express with a one line in social media, and I think that this is. I mean, I'm not trying to criticize it, but I think that this is also problematic. Like in a sense that things are usually not black and white, and in a sense that it doesn't allow us to actually be engaged with something as complicated as your question and what's happening in Documenta in a more responsible way.
And actually, what you just said is exactly what the goal is to have an in-depth conversation about something. So, before you put in the word documenta, I thought you're actually kind of responding in that way because it makes a lot of sense. So you are right. And you're an exemplary, case of someone who shows complexity and cannot be minimized into this rhetoric or a different rhetoric. So it is actually beautiful to hear you say that. It's really about the multiplicity and the varied voices, and not about kind of the easily minimized soundbite. So thank you.
Very generous of you. Thank you. Any other question? I will answer. We will answer.
I can ask another question.
Please do.
Sorry, I don't mean to dominate. It's kind of a general question, but I know every project is different. But some of the photographs that you take, it's really striking for me because it's something that you actually came upon. Seems like by walking, as opposed to an archive, which is a more kind of premeditated event where you go somewhere and you search. How do you come across those moments and those ideas? I was just curious.
That's a good question. I think like in general, I would say that artists have different temperament. Like some of them can stare into it, like some of them can stay and like paint one painting in like, I don't know, a year. And some of them can do like they take the camera and then they put it in. I mean, I don't have to explain to you, you're an artist yourself, that it really changed according to the temperament of the artist. I feel like in the case of this body of work, I kind of grew up with these images. It's not like a visit. And also like working on the Christian Palestinian Archive, I'm working with the community I grew up in. It's not like I'm doing social-based art or whatever people want to call it, and I'm going to different communities and I'm trying to engage. And I'm basically like starting with my own environment, and the commitment is a commitment to myself, first of all. It's not like, and in that sense, like, yes, I went to photograph, and it was a specific occasion that took specific time. It's all analog photography, but I'm walking in this forest as long as I remember myself. So I don't know if this image is a combination of this knowledge, of this visual DNA that I carry with me, or if it's something that just like, I really cannot defer it from my experience as human. Did it make sense, Orit? Yeah, Eugenio is nodding.
Sorry, I was just trapped to trying to write in the chat. Thank you very much. Yes, and super generous talk, Dor. And thank you everyone for hosting. Really, every time I see your work, it builds up on itself, and it's stunning. So it makes a lot of sense. But I would say that it's really incredible that you are able to kind of look at it from the outside or reflect, it's something that you're in all the time. You know, some people need distance, but it's really incredible that you can be in it and still be able to reflect on it. That's really unique.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we still have a little bit of time. So even if someone else wants to pose another question, it would be very welcome. Otherwise, I would like to make a question of interest of my own. And it could be answered by either both of you or either of you. And it would be, what kind of archive is missing? Or what kind of thing, element, experience, image, object is worth archiving, yet not done so?
Dor, this is for you.
Okay. Oh, to be honest, I'm still trying to unwrap everything that I have. I don't have enough time to even like, if you see what's happening now on my desk, I'm too embarrassed. Like the computer is on the desk. If you see what's going on here or how my desktop looked like, I can't even, like my hands doesn't even follow the amount of things that I want to create or to explore, to read about. What is missing? I don't know. I feel like there is so much. I don't think about what is missing. I will say though that when I was in Bogota, one person in the audience said something about the craft of creating family albums. I don't remember her name, but it was a very, very nice question. She said that the albums are being usually, traditionally, not internationally, everywhere, are being usually created by women. Like traditionally, the man held the camera, of course, and photograph, and then the photo albums were created by women. And she was asking about gender, I think, through this question. She was asking about gender roles and how it's being presented. And I think that, I don't know if it's an image that is missing, but this is definitely an interesting read into these materials. Because if you go to like, let's say colonial albums and not albums, archives, you know, the representation of male and female are very specific. Even colonial photography, like the first images that came, my God, I can talk about it for an hour. I'll try to make it short, but the first images that came when photography was invented, they basically tried to reinvent the Holy Land as well. It was about the same time that the roads were open, and you know, the fantasy of Christians, Jewish, Muslims about this place kind of like was wild and maybe far from the truth. It was through painting, like that they experienced it, and now there was an opportunity to experience as photographs. And when the photographers came here, you know, it was a small place at the end of the Ottoman Empire, not very rich, not very, like maybe very far from this image of what it is. So they manipulated photography so it will kind of like create this illusion of what this place is. Everything was staged. And also the roles of men and women, like women specifically were portrayed, the first women that were photographed were usually prostitutes because they used to pay them in different ports to take their image. And in Europe, there was like this hunger to see like this Oriental woman with belly button exposed and so on. It was this almost erotic fantasy. And when you come to the Middle East, when you come to this region, I mean, obviously it was very far from the truth. So they photographed prostitutes, and people actually thought that this is a representation of femininity of the region. I'm just taking one example. I can talk about different kind of types. So I think we are missing this kind of images because we learn from what we have. We can learn about the perspective, obviously, of the colonial gaze, but less about the perspective of the local. So this is missing. I don't think you can place it, but this is missing. This is one example. I can think of 10. Did it make sense, or did I went too complicated and into my head? And
No, not at all. I really like I mean, thinking both about the family album as something that might entice an archive or might kickstart an archive on its own, just because of the typology of the type of images, the type of narratives, you know, this kind of like homegrown curatorial site of the women, kind of like creating the discourse of the family, also deciding who is in and who's out of the family albums. I mean, I know because my mom also kind of like cropped out the head of some of the people of the family. I don't know, someone who perhaps didn't behave very well to her, or some of the pictures of my father have also suffered. I mean, they're divorced now over like 15 years, so this is not an issue anymore. But I mean, I also have like several images torn apart. So yeah, I mean, I really like this. I mean, it's a wonderful answer. So yeah, I'm more than satisfied with it. Eugenia, you wanted to add something else?
No.
Okay, so well, we're very grateful about all of the conversations and all of the ideas. Thank you, Dor, for taking the time, staying up late. I know about your family commitments, so I know taking over an hour of your time is very, very precious. So I would very much like to thank you for that. And to the general public, I would like to thank for staying throughout the conversation. And I would like to invite all of you to Catastrophe by Dor Guez. That will be open until the 4th of September. So we are in our last week, and next one will be the last week of the exhibition. So everyone's very welcome to visit the museum, see the artworks in the real space of the museum, and join the conversation as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Juanico.
thank you so much to both of you and the audience. Thank